They told us it would never happen. They said the system would stop it. They said democracy was too strong, too protected, and too stable. Then a foreign president was arrested, oil fields were seized, borders tightened, and the world didn't vote on any of it. Some called it leadership, some called it necessary, others called it exactly what they feared. And what happens when one man's decisions affect the entire planet and no one can stop him? Was this the dictator we were warned about? Or did we misunderstand power until it was too late? For years, critics warned that Donald Trump could become a dictator, that his rhetoric and style hinted at unchecked power. Supporters said that was fear-mongering, but in 2026, the world watched several events that forced everyone to ask, was that warning justified? From foreign military action in Venezuela to geopolitical tensions with China and Russia to domestic enforcement controversies, many people began to see the world in a stark, even frightening way. Today we explore the reality versus the fear, what actually happened and what this means for democracy. In early January 2026, the United States conducted a military operation in Venezuela that resulted in the capture of President Nicolas Maduro and his wife, flying them to New York to face federal charges. This unprecedented action drew accusations from global leaders and institutions. The UN Security Council spoke of it as potential crime of aggression, with Brazil, China, Russia, and others condemning it as a violation of Venezuelan sovereignty. Russia's government labelled the action illegal and destabilising, warning of imperialist echoes. Meanwhile, the US described the operation as enforcement of existing indictments and a fight against narco-terrorism. But critics argued that using military force in another sovereign nation without explicit international authorization pushed the boundaries of democratic checks and balances. This event shifted perceptions for many. Was this decisive leadership or executive power without constraint? Part of the backdrop to Venezuela was a broader strategic shift, what commentators have called the Monroe Doctrine, a reimagining of the old Monroe Doctrine meant to reassert US dominance in the Western Hemisphere and counter influence from Russia and China. Under this philosophy, unilateral action, even military, is justified as protecting US interests and preempting rival powers. Supporters argue this shows a strong global posture, but critics see it as unilateralism turning into assertiveness without accountability, something many people fear in a dictator, and rightfully so. Part of the dictator narrative hinges on effectiveness, that a strong leader should resolve crises quickly. But in 2026, the Russian-Ukraine war was ongoing and unresolved. Tensions with China, especially over global influence and control of critical regions, were rising. And other global conflicts continued without clear intervention or resolution. Whether by choice or limitation of power, the inability to end these major international conflicts led to some to question whether forceful rhetoric actually translated into global stability. Some saw this as evidence that even concentrated executive power doesn't guarantee results. Others saw it as evidence of overreach. Another major area of fear for critics was domestic policy. During Trump's political career and presidency, there were persistent claims about immigration enforcement disproportionality targeting people of colour, especially in ICE operations and deportations. While fact-checking organisations have pointed out instances where claims about criminality and migration were inaccurate or misleading, the perception shaped by rhetoric and policy enforcement has fuelled fears of discrimination and unequal treatment under the law. This contributed to a public narrative amplified on social media that enforcement agencies operated without sufficient oversight, which critics warned could be a hallmark of authoritarian governance. So how do we actually unpack the fear of dictatorship from reality? On one hand, use of military force abroad, aggressive strategic doctrine, and polarising domestic policy and strong executive statements, these all look like power being exercised with fewer restraints. This is the image that fed the dictatorship worry. On the other hand, the US still operates within constitutional checks and balances. Congress, courts, public opinion, and media remain powerful institutions. Military action remains controversial and not universally supported. International law continues to matter to global players. This shows that even at its most forceful, the US under Trump remains a constitutional republic, not a dictatorship. One of the most striking elements of this period wasn't just policy, it was perception. After the Venezuelan operation, both China and Russia launched influence campaigns to shape public discourse in the US, deploying narratives that ranged from praise to outright criticism of American actions, aiming to create confusion and discredit the US leadership globally. This highlights a key reality of the 21st century. Global powers use information as a battlefield. So when social media threads talk about Trump as a dictator or about government overreach, it's not just political discourse, it's a part of a complex ecosystem of narratives, some domestic, some international. And this doesn't prove dictatorship, it shows the power of perception. Fear of dictatorship was a constant theme in political debate long before 2026. And recent events, provocative, controversial, and unprecedented, have given people reasons to revisit those fears. But power isn't rhetoric alone. It's defined by institutions, by oversight, by accountability, and in a democratic system, by the consent of the governed. So was Trump a dictator? The answer depends on how you define a dictatorship, and whether you still believe the system around him holds him in check. Today's world may feel more turbulent and aggressive, but turbulence isn't tyranny. A leader can act forcefully, but democracy lives in the limits of that power.